Well, hello, hello, hello. Thank you for finding a window of time to join us while we take part in this experience of growth and insight into Naropa University. Now, I hope everyone has maybe their drink of choice. I've got some coffee right here. Also, a little bit of water, a little hydration for the growth that we might experience today. We're going to have a chance to hear from various Naropa leaders and expand our understanding through a sample class and join a broad array of breakout rooms after this session. Now, before we dive into all that, just a little bit about the Naropa community before we dive into the community that we have here today. Founded in 1974 by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Naropa was the first accredited university to bring contemplative education to the West. Now at Naropa, mindfulness practice is truly at the center of everything that we do, and we believe that changing the world starts from within. Whether you're going for a master's, your bachelor's, a certificate program, academic life at Naropa is contemplated and complemented by self-reflection and learning to be mindful. One aspect of contemplative practice that is close to our hearts here at Naropa is the Naropa Bow. Now, the Naropa Bow represents something unique to every community member, but here's what it means to me. When I go through the Naropa Bow, it's a chance for me to contain a little bit of energy and transition from one activity to the next. So if you are in your home, in a public space, if you'd like to take part in maybe your first Naropa Bow, maybe your 100th, I'd like to have anyone join in with me. So how I walk through the Naropa Bow, close my eyes, I get my feet flat and planted back to the ground. Plenty of deep breaths. Straighten up my spine, get a line back in to the earth. And I always start physical. How I'm feeling in my body, if I'm feeling any stress, where that might be. Then I move to my mental state. A little bit more about if I'm feeling any anxiety. Am I feeling thoughts of being overwhelmed? Some of those are coming up. Where might be they coming from? And after I move past that, I focus on transitioning. Thinking of what we were just doing, how I feel about that finishing, and transition into the next activity that we'll be taking part in. And when I feel centered and ready, a simple bow at the waist. Well, thank you for those who took part in that. Again, maybe that was your first, maybe your 100th Naropa Bow, but now we are ready to dive right in. We spoke a little bit about Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, our founder and leader of yesteryear, but now it brings me immense joy to introduce our leader of today, President Charles Leaf. President since 2012, his impact on Naropa began long before that. President Leaf participated in some of those earliest conversations that worked to create Naropa University. He's been an active member of the community since our creation in 1974, acting as a lawyer and as a founding member of the Board of Trustees. Following a 28-year career as a social entrepreneur, developing affordable housing, healthcare clinics, early childhood education centers, and businesses, all in the service of homelessness, low-income people, and communities, Chuck returned to Boulder and to Naropa. He and his wife, the Buddhist teacher and writer Judy Leaf, who led Naropa from 1980 to 1985, are the parents of two daughters, both who are Naropa graduates. Thank you very much for joining us today, President Leaf.
Thanks, Peter, and welcome everybody. It's a delight to have you join us for a little bit of time today. I want to thank the admissions team. Peter is the face, and behind him are a lot of admissions counselors who have worked really hard to put this event together, and so gratitude to them. And also express my thanks and your good fortune that you're going to have an opportunity in a few minutes to experience a sample class that's being offered by Professor Trevor Buser, who has joined Naropa over the last few years and has made an exceptional impact on our Graduate School of Counseling and Psychology. And so I'm grateful to Trevor for taking some time also to share a Naropa classroom experience with you all. So much gratitude. Naropa is looking toward our next 50 years and beyond. We were founded in 1974, and in 2024, we will do a lot of things to commemorate our half century of providing higher education opportunities in the US with this sort of audacious model of incorporating contemplative practices with academic training and experiential learning. Naropa arose out of a time of turmoil. It was a time of great concern about the war in Vietnam. It was a time when we were dealing with a president the summer we started, a president who resigned. It was a time of great focus on civil rights. And in a way, Naropa was a response to the fact that there was a community of practitioners and artists and scholars who felt like coming together in a cross-disciplinary way was one way in which we could deal with a society that was definitely boiling over in a way. Maybe predictably, maybe unfortunately, maybe inevitably, I think we find ourselves in 2021 in a similar situation. And so as Naropa is looking to move forward, we're both remembering where we came from, but even more importantly, we're taking a hard look at where we are now and where we're going as an institution. And sharing that with you all as prospective students is the kind of linchpin of the work that we're doing. What we're dealing with now, obviously, I don't have time to get into the details, but clearly it's not just the pandemic, but the pandemic has defined us in so many ways. It's also how we're addressing challenges to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. What can we do to tackle the climate crisis in a way that's not cynical and that actually would lead to some real change? What are we doing in general about deep social polarization other than giving up? How does Naropa fit in this conversation, which is happening around the world? One area, of course, is the statistically clear sense that our mental health care system is broken and that access to mental health care, especially equitable access to mental health care, borders on non-existent in many places in the world. And it is an area where Naropa and Naropa's alumnex and faculty have been playing a crucial role for the last 48 years. I think in general, my view is that predictability is gone. Predictability about what a higher education experience is going to be, should look like. Predictability about what solutions fit what problems. Predictability about the kinds of silos that we were used to living in. All of that is sort of off the table. And I think that one thing that we've found at Naropa is that and hearing from both our alumnex and from the places where our alums are engaging is that future leaders are leaders who are grounded in the personal training and experience of mindfulness and compassion and how that's combined with academic training and community engagement. It also involves our ability as an institution to be non-predictable, to not be as traditional as we were. We're no longer an undergraduate and graduate bricks and mortar university alone. We love community at Naropa and we are doing everything we can to come back together in community. But we're also incredibly happy with the way in which our more flexible offerings of fully online or hybrid learning has allowed us to expand the body of students that we can support. Frankly, it's also allowed us, in the case of Trevor and others, to expand the faculty body that we have for people that for a whole host of reasons can't move to Boulder, Colorado, but who offer much to the Naropa community. And it offers, obviously, to students who need the flexibility of non-traditional ways of learning so that a Naropa experience is not limited to the relatively smaller group of people who can be in Boulder for 2 or 3 or 4 years. And we're delighted to be able to have expanded our offerings in the way that we have. I think that all the social sectors, the for-profit, nonprofit, the creative, all civil society as a whole, are going to heal and grow in the future because of out-of-the-box thinkers, out-of-the-box leaders, out-of-the-box graduates of universities like Naropa. And so our opportunity to share with you at the very front end of what we hope is a Naropa journey is something which is a sort of highlight of our rhythm as a university. We do these events every month or so, and it's always an exceptional opportunity to just think about what to say. How do we actually present ourselves to you so that you're curious enough to want to take next steps? So I'm going to turn this back to Peter. I will just say, as I always do, that we have an incredible a team of people, admissions, financial aid, faculty, advisors, who can answer better than I can all the detailed questions that you may have. But I'm also very available through my office. You can get the connection online. And if there are any questions in general about Naropa, our history, where we're going, and there's something that I can offer that might help you make a decision to take some next steps, I welcome that and invite you to get in touch. So thank you all. Thanks for being here, and enjoy the rest of the day. And I will turn this back to Peter.
Thank you very much for being here with us, President Lee. Now, if today's sample class is our big meal, we're at a buffet at a fancy restaurant right now. Our appetizers are complete, and we're about to move on to our main course. So hopefully we've got some room to eat and room to learn. We'll move on to our sample class now. Today's sample class will be taught by Dr. Trevor Buser. And today we're going to discuss some challenges in interpersonal conflict, as well as some conflict resolution strategies that are all grounded in contemplative and compassionate practices. Dr. Buser is a core faculty member in the Mindfulness-Based Transpersonal Counseling Department at Naropa, as well as co-director for the online hybrid delivery of that concentration. A licensed professional counselor, certified school counselor, and approved clinical supervisor, Dr. Buser also served as the president of the International Association of Addictions and Offender Counselors. His research centers on cognitive predictors of non-suicidal self-injury, mindfulness and counselor education, and spirituality. Recently, he began to write children's books with a focus on social emotional learning. He also brings a dedicated focus on addictions counseling. Thank you very much for your guidance today, Doctor.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you today. Peter, thank you for that introduction, and I want to thank the entire admissions team for this invitation to share with you briefly today. We have about half an hour. I feel the pressure that this is the main course of this buffet that Peter's been describing, but I felt very encouraged and inspired by what I'm seeing in the chat board. I love seeing the energy from you all who are listening as you introduce yourselves on the chat board. I hope that at parts in this presentation, we'll continue that interactive flow. I'd love to hear more from you as we continue. So let me see if I can put my screen in full screen mode. That might be a better visual for you. And as Peter mentioned, my name's Trevor Buser. I'm an associate professor in the Mindfulness-Based Transpersonal Counseling program. It's a master's degree program at Naropa University. And we're really teaching students to step into this role of clinical mental health counselor. And one of the skills that we teach for our counseling students, as Peter was mentioning, is how to work with conflict. Of course, as you might imagine, in counseling settings, many clients choose to come to counseling because they're struggling with some interpersonal conflict in their lives. And so counselors need to know how to support clients in that situation. And actually, I would add, since this is an event for prospective students of Naropa, that learning how to navigate conflict skillfully is particularly important, I believe, at a place like Naropa because of our commitment to contemplative education. Part of contemplative education, as you may know, is an accent on the quality of our community. In classrooms, for example, we emphasize clear and caring communication, empathy, genuine interest in one another, a desire for sincere relationships. That's all part of the quality of community that I'm talking about. In fact, recently at our last convocation, President Leaf made the point that especially during the pandemic, when many of us have been socially isolated from one another, it's an important time for us to practice and exercise our empathy muscles. So that's part of what we have in store today. I also think, as I just give you some opening remarks on this presentation, that many of us would agree that interpersonal conflict is common in a variety of settings in our lives. In our families, in friendships, in work settings, school settings, religious institutions. And my intention today, what I'd like to cover with you today, is a model for managing conflict, for working with conflict. And what I'd like to do today is actually begin with a case study. And as I share with you this situation that will be our case study that we'll work with today, I want to plant a question in our minds. It's actually a question I often hold in mind as I approach conflicts in my life. How can we work with conflict in such a way, and you'll see this question on the bottom of this slide, how do we work with conflict in such a way that we can develop consensus, that we can develop a shared vision, shared interests in the midst of this very conflict situation? And that's the question I'd like to invite you to hold in your attention during our brief time together. And let me describe to you this case study, which actually happened to me. So it's based on a true life event. And as I share this event, I'd like you to think about how would you be likely to respond if you were in this situation. In this instance, this situation, I was a graduate student at the time at Syracuse University. And I found myself in the middle of a conflict with a complete stranger on campus. I had booked a room on campus for a club meeting. As it turned out, a professor had also booked that same room at the same time. And when this professor arrived, my group of about 50 students was already assembled in this space. Our meeting was underway. And the professor very quickly entered to the center of the room and was irate, was furious, saying that he had scheduled the room and had no idea why we were there. So there's a lot of anger in this situation. And I would like you to consider here, as you see this first bullet point under case study, what would you be likely to do? I'd like to just give you a couple of moments of silent reflection to kind of place yourself in this situation. I'm not going to ask you at this time to share out on the chat board what you'd be likely to do, but just a moment for reflection as you think about and picture this situation. We'll just open up a short period of silence here. I'd like to share with you today a model developed by actually a professor from the university that I was attending. His name is Neil Katz, and he wrote a book called Communication and Conflict Mediation Skills. And the book presents a model called the Empathy Assertiveness Cycle that has served me well and really builds on this concept of empathy. And before we move on in this presentation, I'd like to hear from some of you. I'd like to encourage you to drop your ideas in the chat board. I think that all of us have some familiarity with this concept of empathy, the practice of empathy. How would you describe it in your own words. I'm curious to hear your definitions of empathy. If you had to describe this to someone, what happens during an empathic moment? How would you phrase that? Let me take a look. I'm going to open up the chat board. Let's see some of the ideas that are rolling in. Yeah, Lisa's writing, it's about listening, showing curiosity, feeling with. Jenna writes to feel within your body what you perceive as someone else's emotional experience. Very nice. We start to see some of the contemplative aspects of this act of empathy in a statement like that. Continuing to read here, calming myself, asking for clarification. Let's see here. Brian's writing to us about this offer of group collaborative learning. And then a possible model based on offering the room to the professor. Peyton's writing about asking questions about others' feelings, validating, moving forward with this information. Erica says taking time to understand someone else's perspective. Jamia, being able to feel what others are going through on an emotional level. So I very much agree that part of this is feeling. It's about our emotional experience, feeling our way into another person's situation. And others here, Marlena, Jessica, Karen, writing about acknowledging, accepting. I like that word acceptance has been added to our conversation. You know, sometimes we'll listen to someone and immediately move toward attempting to fix. And I agree with Marlena that this first step of listening deeply involves a spirit of acceptance, of just allowing what's here and really investigating it, being curious, as someone said. To experience someone else's emotion as your own, connect in a way that puts you in their shoes. Wonderful. Asking to talk and collaborate for shared solutions, showing that you understand how they're feeling, stepping outside yourself. Wonderful. Stepping away from assumptions. Reminds me a lot of a practice we talk about often here at Naropa, which is beginner's mind, really opening up to possibilities in this moment rather than assuming that we have it all figured out at the start. Removing ego from the situation. So yeah, there's this compassionate piece of empathy where we're genuinely interested in the experience of others. Yeah. And others are talking about some possibilities here for working with that case study that I mentioned. You might ask for documentation, as one person wrote. Others are writing more about empathy, and really appreciating your comments and your ideas. I think you're phrasing, you're defining empathy so clearly, allowing others' feelings, understanding points of view, meeting others' experience. I like that phrase, meeting another person's experience. Let me share with you a definition of empathy that means a lot to me. It comes from a counseling theorist named Kohut, who said that empathy is thinking and feeling our way. So there's this holistic quality, thinking and feeling our way into another person's worldview. So that's one definition of empathy. And then another very important theorist, author in the counseling field named Carl Rogers said, yes, and yet there's more. And the piece that he said, there's something more to what we mean by empathy that he really accented in his work. He said in the counseling relationship, empathy is not just our internal understanding of what someone else is experiencing, but it has to go one step further where we show this other person that we understand where they're coming from. So in other words, as Rogers viewed it, empathy involves saying something to show this other person that you're grasping, at least to some degree, what they're feeling, what they're experiencing in this moment. And there are a lot of ways that we do this. One of the common ways we show empathy is through paraphrasing, where you give a short synopsis of what you've heard from this other person. I'll talk about some other ways and some examples. So let me tie it back to the case study here to make it more concrete. As I mentioned, that case study actually happened to me. And as it turned out, I had just taken a course at Syracuse University by Neil Katz, the author of the book that I just referenced. And the course was actually called Conflict Mediation. And then just a week after this course finished, so very shortly after I completed that semester-long course, I found myself in the middle of that conflict with a stranger, which was our case study today. And I remember thinking in that moment, what a coincidence, how timely that I just finished a semester-long class on conflict mediation. And so my response in that moment was actually quite different than what it might have been had I not undergone, 15 weeks of training and discussion and reflection on conflict. And what I said in that moment to this professor, the first thing I said was, that must be so frustrating to follow all the steps of reserving a classroom and finding that someone else is here using this space. So I started with empathy, just along the lines of what you all were just describing, trying to meet this person by understanding where they are coming from. And that's the first step in this empathy assertiveness cycle developed by Neil Katz. We show the other person, as Rogers would say, we show them that we're beginning to understand where they're coming from. I think one of the more powerful ways of showing empathy is not just paraphrasing, but naming the feeling state that you're perceiving in the other's experience, naming the emotion that you're hearing in this person. So in the example I just gave, I was hearing frustration and anger. And so I said, it must be so frustrating to have this happen. We sometimes call that a reflection of feeling in the counseling field. And it's one of our most basic foundational skills as counselors. And a very important step after you show empathy is to come to a full stop. We create a gap. So this is another contemplative aspect of the process. We pause because we must allow the person some space to respond to our empathy and affirm that, in fact, we do understand, that we are approximating what they're experiencing by our words. So put another way, I would say we must wait. As part of this process, we must be patient enough to wait until this other person indicates to us that our empathy was accurate to some extent. And if that other person says to our empathy, no, it's not that at all, it's more about this and that, then we revise our empathic statement and we try again. Oh, I see what you're saying. You're not frustrated, you're exhausted at trying so hard to navigate a broken system around how we reserve space at this university. So again, after each attempt of empathy, remember an important piece has to do with waiting. We wait for them to affirm that we got it more or less right in our empathic statement, that we're capturing where they're coming from with our words. And I think empathy is such a vital step for so many reasons. Empathy, in my experience, can change the tone completely in a conflict situation. It can diffuse anger. When we show empathy, we start to establish trust with another person because we're actively caring for that other person. And in many cases, what I've noticed is that in my expression of genuine care, we start to create a space where we do some mutual caring because many of us have a natural resonance with the care that we receive to others. You could say that many of us have this feeling of reciprocity that emerges as we experience the gifts and care and concern of others, the gifts of their time, the gifts of their interest in us. Let me advance here to the next slide. What I'd like to do is give you some practice here. So let's go ahead and see if we can light up the chat board again. I'd like you to practice with me on empathy. I'm going to make up a statement here. You can imagine that you're sitting across from someone and they say this to you. Imagine this person says this comment to you, and if your only goal in the situation was to show empathy, as I mentioned, it could be a paraphrase where you catch the gist of what they just said and restate it back. It could be that you just simply name an emotion that you're hearing. What would you say? There's no one right answer, of course, so let's get some of your ideas. Try putting this into your own words or naming the emotion you're hearing, and I'll read it out loud. Imagine someone said to you, "I can't believe I trusted my sister-in-law. I hate her. She'd start criticizing my mother-in-law and get me going. And then after she got me saying negative things, I found out she was going back and repeating everything I said to her. Now my mother-in-law hates me." Imagine that this was voiced to you. What's something that you could say with our sole goal in this moment to show empathy in your words, to really meet them and allow these feelings that they're having? Yeah, I'm hearing these comments about a sense of betrayal. It's really showing up for many of you. Yeah, naming that there's so much sadness and anger to be lied to in this way. Some of you are naming, what a difficult situation. I think that a comment like that too can just help slow us down and recognize we're in the mix right now. We're in the stew right now. This is a challenging one. I want to acknowledge that. Must have felt very hard to show trust, someone wrote, and then in turn feel betrayed. Yeah. Sounds like you're hurt. Another person's writing, this just happened in their home. Deep betrayal, frustration, how confusing. That's a really helpful addition to the confusion, the disorientation, how unsettling to think one way and then find the rug being pulled out. Yeah, thank you all. These are wonderful. And my impression is that these would be very helpful ways to sit with someone, to join them, to meet with them, as you said before. Hearing the frustration. Yeah. Another person writes, I would feel very sad to have my trust broken like that. Another nice way to empathize, and I think that's part of feeling our way into the experience. If I were in this experience, how would that impact me? And that can be part of the process. And then ultimately, most of all, what we want to understand is, regardless of how it might have impacted me, what I'm most interested in is how is it impacting this person? What are the clues that they're sending to me about how this experience is affecting their lives? Wonderful. Thank you for these comments. I'm not sure if I got to all of them. Yeah, I think another person noted it might feel unsafe for this person to communicate after having their trust betrayed, if I understand the gist of that comment. I think that's a very observant point too. All right, so let me go on to the next step here in the process. And I'm also aware of our time, that we just have about 15 more minutes together. But I want to share with you the other half of this empathy assertiveness cycle. After we've shown empathy and we've received the affirmation from the other person that to some extent we're on the right track with what we've been saying and understanding their experience, after those steps, you can then introduce your point of view in the midst of a conflict, your perspective. And this is the assertiveness part of the empathy assertiveness cycle. As they say, yes, to us if we've said to them an empathic moment, you're frustrated, as they say, yes, it's very frustrating. I did everything right in reserving this classroom. That's when I can bring my own point of view. I can say something like, I hear that frustration. And at the same time, I'm concerned because I also went through the same steps to reserve this room. And I received the confirmation that it had been reserved for our meeting. That's the assertiveness part. And a very important point that Neil Katz writes about in the book and really emphasized in our course, remember the cyclical, repetitive quality of this part. You might need to engage in the empathy assertiveness cycle multiple times before both sides of a conflict begin to understand one another. For example, after I bring the alternate perspective from my point of view, the other person might say, well, you must have gotten it wrong. There's no way they double book us in the system for this classroom. You must have arranged for a different date. And in that case, I'm going back to the start, going back to my empathy. I see what you're saying. You really trust in the reservation system. It's worked for you before. And again, going back to my empathy, I'm waiting to make sure the other person senses that I understand what they're saying. And then again, I can come back to my alternate perspective. At the same time, I'm confused in this moment because I have the confirmation in my email and it does say today's date and time. That'd be the assertiveness piece. So that's an example. We might go back and forth a few cycles until we gradually de-escalate the situation and we're starting to get on the same page. That's what I was talking about at the start of this presentation. How are we going to do this hard work of developing consensus, of coming to a shared view? And I really believe it's that seesaw of empathy, seesaw to assertiveness, empathy, back and forth can be one way that we work toward that consensus building. And then finally, in this model, you move toward naming the competing interests and brainstorming solutions together, collaborating. Some of you actually mentioned this already in the chat board. So very prescient comments earlier here in the chat board. You kind of saw the end piece already from the start. In the Neil Katz model, you move to this stage of collaboration on possible solutions once you sense from the other person some recognition of your point of view, some openness to more than one side of the story. So I think one really interesting aspect of this model, if you notice the sequencing, empathy comes first, sharing your point of view comes second in this model, working on solutions comes third. As I said before, a common pattern that I see in novice counselors, students who are just beginning to practice their counseling skills, is that they'll skip right away to solution generation and completely jump over that all-important step of empathy and really learning the subtleties and nuances of a person's situation. So if I were at this stage with that professor, I might say something like, so if we put our concerns together, it sounds like we need to find a way to hold your meeting and my meeting in the hour ahead. And again, we want to take our time in this step and get their affirmation, make sure that we're on the same page about what we're needing to accomplish together in terms of next steps. So I might ask the person, does that sound about right for you? Did I capture what would be helpful for you in this situation? And if they say yes, you can move toward the brainstorming phase. I might say, what ideas do you have about reaching both of these goals? I'm open to your ideas on this. And what I'd like to share with you all, that really captures the collaborative spirit of this model, but we really see from the start, it's anchored in compassion and collaboration and community building with the empathy. I found personally this model to be incredibly helpful in various situations. I've utilized it with students, with parents, with clients, with colleagues, with leaders. And I believe its power is in its empathy, is in its genuine caring for the other person's perspective. As I said before, there's an aspect of beginner's mind in this process. I'm curious. I want to be a student of this other person's point of view. There's likely something that I've missed in this challenging situation. And in that regard, actually, we need one another in the midst of conflict. And we need these moments to slow down and really understand where others are coming from. And also in the balance here is not just the caring for others, but also caring for self, a standing up for one's self, for one's own understanding in the situation. And that's the assertiveness part. So I think it's a very wise balance. And in my view, an embodiment of many of the qualities that we seek to uphold in an environment of contemplative education. So I wanted to close my time with you today by letting you know how this conflict concluded, wrapped up with this professor in the case study. In that situation, I mentioned to you that I led with empathy. I just had this course prepping me and priming me to do so. And what I noticed was that empathy quickly diffused the professor's anger. And we started to talk about options together. And he said he could check on open rooms across the hall. And in a very short amount of time, it was quite remarkable to me, he went from being furious with me to conjointly, together, working up solutions and landing on a viable option where his class was able to find some space right on the spot. So certainly I do want to acknowledge conflicts don't always work through this quickly or smoothly as the case study experience that I shared with you. But I do believe very sincerely that this model can be a useful addition for navigating the inevitable conflicts that come our way in the different settings of our lives. I hope it will be helpful to you as well. And I want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank you for your attention to this part of the presentation today. Thank you for listening, and I wish you very well, no matter what you choose. I'm so delighted to know that you're interested in Naropa, but ultimately I just want to wish you very well on your educational journey. Thank you for being here. Take good care, everyone.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you. And I'm thinking that we have a few extra minutes. So if people might have some questions from the course, we do have some extra time to maybe focus on a couple questions. If anyone wants to send any out to the chat, would love to get some of those out there now. And I have one question for you, Doctor, and it focuses on that assertiveness piece. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more towards maybe some ways when trying to resolve some conflict. When can we know it's time to focus a little bit less on empathy and maybe on some of those assertive tips that you were sharing with us?
I believe that one of the indicators that the door is opening for an opportunity to be assertive. Oh, sorry, hold on one second. I want to make sure my mic is on. Yeah, I think one of the indicators, Peter, is that, remember I said in this model, we're doing empathy work, and then we're checking in with that person to see if our empathy landed, if in fact we were on the right track in terms of naming their experience, that we're understanding it accurately. So there's that waiting moment, see how they respond after our empathy. If they do signal to us that, yes, we're starting to understand it, I believe that's one of the clues, that's one of the indicators that now is a time when we can start to introduce another perspective from our own experience into the mix and see how that's received by the other person. So Typically, and we don't always capture the other person's meaning in our first attempt, and we might only capture a part of it. So they might say yes to our initial disclosure, our initial sharing, our viewpoint on their perspective, our empathic moment, but they might say, but there's also this other thing. And so that's why it's a very patient process. We really want to hear them through. And there's something called, in one of the traditions that I study, there's something called prolonged engagement. And it's this idea that when you really invest your time, and this is part of, I think, why counseling is so effective as well. I mean, in these days, in the healthcare industry, in many medical settings, my experience is that I'm often being rushed out of the door and have very little time with a provider, with some kind of treatment provider. In counseling, especially clinical mental health counseling, we're often sitting down with someone for an hour at a time. That's a typical model. So we're starting to invest some prolonged engagement, and that's really what this model hinges on as well, and part of why it's so helpful for relationship building. We're really signaling kind of a meta message just through our presence and our patience that we care and that we're going to see this through, and that we want to hear what's significant, what really matters to this person, recognizing that our first attempt at empathy might not capture all the essential pieces, and they might push back, and we can say, okay, I welcome that. I want to hear more. So I would say when you start to hear the other person saying, yes, that's it, you got it. And this happens often in counseling when our empathic moment lands. If you hear them saying, yes, exactly, there's almost like a relief or a release in the system when someone gives us an accurate empathy. I've seen this a lot of times with clients say, yes, that's it. And it's like, it's like this sigh of relief. Someone finally understands. When you see that moment, to me, that's a sign of de-escalation, of joining, of coming together, of collaboration, of caring that's been conveyed. And now I can share, and the language is actually quite intentional in that slide. At the same time, your perspective and, not but and, here's my perspective on this situation. Sometimes when we use the language like but this and this, it can actually discount what went first. So we're actually just trying to enter with that beginner's mind. What you said, and here's another perspective from my point of view, my experience that I'd like to share with you, and just put in the mix together as something we can sort out. Thank you for that question, Peter. I see that we have a few more minutes and some more questions came through. Let me tune into the chat board here. Yeah, someone asks, how can we initiate conflicts? Yeah, sometimes we do need to initiate a conflict in our lives, initiate a different point of view. And with this model in mind, I think one way to go about this would be to share with the person, again, leading with empathy. I might say something like, I'm noticing in this situation that I have a very different point of view, and I would like to share that with you. As a first step, though, I'd like to make sure that I grasp where you're coming from. Can you tell me more about what you're doing here? Or can you tell me more about your perspective on X, Y, and Z? And then engage with them around that empathy. And actually, in that case, you've already foreshadowed the assertiveness step. But I think your work in empathy and collaboration will really set the tone for that conversation throughout. So that'd be one way to adapt the CATS model when you're the one who's actually initiating the conversation and the different point of view. Remember, too, it's a cyclical process. So even if you were to lead, in some situations, we just simply do need to lead with a step of assertiveness. Remember that CATS really viewed this as iterative and cyclical, repetitive. So as you share your point of view, I think another embodiment of this model would be to remember that empathy can still be part of the equation. If someone responds to you, you can then signal to them you understand how they're responding to you and how this is landing for them. And then you could enter the cycle at that point. Yeah, someone's asking about open-ended questions. So I'm just noticing the time. There's some questions here that I wasn't able to get to in the interest of time, but let me just go sequentially here as best I can. Megan asks, what do you think about open-ended questions? Like, how did that make you feel? Absolutely. We use open-ended questions all the time in counseling. That's one of our other skills. The only point I'd make is that I would say a well-placed question that is organic to the conversation connotes a degree of empathy because it shows you're tracking, that you're engaged, that you could ask a relevant question, but it doesn't convey nearly as much empathy as what we were talking about before, the reflection of feeling, the paraphrase, where we try to put it in our own language in the form of a statement rather than a question. But I do think open questions certainly could be part of this. You could say to someone, yeah, I'd like to understand more of the frustration around this. Can you tell me what's happening for you in that situation? Yeah. So I apologize we didn't get to all of the questions here, and I think there are about 5 to 10 that I haven't been able to address in our limited time. But Peter, I'm glad you opened up some time for this and this kind of back and forth. And I also want to respect that there's a lot more in the buffet, as you put it. So I want to be sensitive to the timing the admissions team has developed for this event as well.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for answering some of our questions, some really transformative and useful information.